today, a little bit of what I'm going to go over. I'm going to talk about the 9 key element plan that the county is administering. As Karen alluded to, this was developed out of a community project. The community got together and said, let's do something about it. They got a hold of the DNR and local county staff and said, let's all come together and make something happen. And the result of that is the 9 key element plan is fundamentally community-led. But currently, in my role as watershed coordinator, I'm essentially administer, sort of holding everything together into the plan. And it's got a lot of different steps, but it's a big team on the county side of things. Uh-oh. There we go. So on the county side of things, we have a lot of staff that makes this happen. So they're throughout the entire county. Chuck, Anna, and Megan work throughout the entire county. I am full-time exclusively on the 14-mile watershed. So they'll cover the entire county, including 14 Mile, but my priority, like I was saying, is just coordinating just the 9 key element plan. So I am full-time on this project for everybody here. So Anna James is our water resource specialist. She will work with anybody interested on shoreline restoration, any sort of projects, any assessments. She's our specialist there. And Chuck is our engineer, our resource conservationist. He'll help with all the technical standards and making sure everything's there. Megan keeps us all organized and showing up to work as our program coordinator. She keeps everything together. And then Dustin Grant is our new director out of planning and zoning and land and water combined office. All right, so there's a map in the back, right? And that shows us the 14-mile watershed. The 14-mile watershed goes from Plainfield down through Rome to Lake Petenwell there. And then from the north to the south, there's Archer and Tower Roads. Up here, this goes into Portage County, and this is in Cher County, and a good half of it is Adams County. As part of this program, do I need the mic over there? Whoa, whoa. Sorry, when I'm facing the TV, it's probably quieter, huh? Yeah, okay. So as part of this program, I'm working through Adams County, right? But I'm also working with the 3 other counties, Wood, Portage, and Waushara. So they are all collaborators on this as well. So I'll start a little bit with the boring stuff. We're going to be talking a lot. Still too loud? Okay. So we'll be talking a lot today about a bunch of different things within the watershed. And it's kind of hard to follow along if we're not all on the same page as towards what we're talking about. So I kind of want to open up with that. I want to talk a little bit about what a watershed is. So as you saw on the map, a watershed is all of the area that drains to a common point with rainfall. So if rain falls anywhere here in the watershed, we'd expect in a couple of years that water to be flowing down 14 Mile into Lake Petenwell. That's how we define a watershed, and that's why it's much larger than just around the lakes. It's everything around it that would drain there. And this includes the surface water, lakes and rivers like the tri-lakes, like the Ola Ditch, like 14 Mile. It also includes all the water that flows under the ground, that you pull up in your wells, that come up through springs. That whole system is a watershed. So what about our watershed here, right? 14 Mile. Well, the 14 Mile watershed has been altered a lot since the 60s. The lakes were dammed up in the 60s and 70s as part of a development project. And then after that, there was a lot of watershed development, both in agriculture and around the lakes. A lot of houses went in, a lot of lots got developed, a lot of marsh and forest land got converted into residential or industrial or agricultural uses. Dams collect water, as you see. They also are really good at collecting everything else in the water. So dams are there to collect the water and create the lake, but everything else in the water is also collected. You can even see how this algae, catches up and collects at the edge of that dam. All right? And so all the water, since all the water comes from the land, all the land use in the entire watershed impacts what reaches those dams and these lakes, right? And we can see that here with the illustration, is that all the land use gets concentrated into these lakes. So the lakes are sort of the bucket that collects everything that happens in the watershed. So a little crash course on what actually we're talking about with water quality, all right? So water quality refers to the suitability of the lakes, of the water, to be used for what we're using it for. In this case, right, we're talking about drinking water, we're talking about water recreation, and we're also talking about the lake's health itself. Now, when we talk about poor water quality, it means that any of those three things are impaired. Maybe you can't go out jet skiing or swimming because there's a blue-green algae bloom. Maybe the water's not safe to drink. Maybe the fishing isn't very good, right? Those are all what we're talking about with water quality. The cause of those water quality issues are nutrients, all right? Now, those are oftentimes, you'll be most familiar with them as fertilizers that you might put on your lawn, but they take a lot of different forms. We're concerned about two main types, nitrogen and phosphorus. If you get a bag of fertilizer, it'll have three numbers, N, P, K. Those are three big nutrients that plants use, that organisms use, and that's what we're most familiar with. And in the watershed, these nutrients, when there's too many of them, they become a pollutant. Too much of a good thing. Too many brownies, too much ice cream, it's a bad thing if you can't handle it, right? So in this case, we have both new nutrients entering the system from lawns, from fertilizer applications, but we also have old nutrients because the lakes, like I said, collect everything that's in the water, and this has been going on since the 60s now. So even if you yourself don't use fertilizers or haven't put in a new driveway or tilled over some fields, people for 100 years before you have, right? And so that's part of the struggles. We have both what's happening now and fixing what's happened in the past. So how do the nutrients get into the water, right? How does this nitrogen, how does this phosphorus get into the water and create these issues? Well, some of it comes from runoff. And runoff is an important concept because a lot of the practices we're talking about and a lot of things that you guys can do to help involves intercepting, stopping the water from flowing directly from driveways, yards, ditches, upstream, the forest north of your lot, straight into the lake, right? And so runoff is that water flowing over the soil surface. A lot of nutrients enter water through soil. Soil will grab onto those nutrients, and when they get carried in that water and you have that brown slurry in the spring, that is all just extremely rich. It's a protein shake to the algae. All right, and it looks it too. So those are two major sources of runoff. It's dissolved in the water or erosion. But we also have nutrients entering the water through the soil. And that's why even if you're a mile away from the lakes, what you put on the ground can go into the water, whether it's a cigarette butt or whether it's spilled gasoline or fertilizer or manure. It goes through both the surface and underground. All right, here's my reminder. Just talked about a lot of stuff. And I was wondering then, I just here for questions. We do have handed out were note cards. If you have questions about this, there's a bit more technical material, but all of this relates to what we'll be talking about today in detail. Does anybody have any questions about causes of algae, what nutrients are, how this process works?
Is there good and bad nutrients?
Yeah, so nutrients themselves aren't bad. They're not really the problem. The problem is too much of them. Because normally what you'll have is, even if we took the entire watershed and we paved it over and didn't let any water come off the land, we would still have this bounty of nutrients in the water. And that's going to take a long time for organisms, for plants and animals and the whole system to use it up. In the same way as, you know, if you have a coffee in the morning, you get that big jolt and then it tapers off over time and then you need another re-up. For the algae, this is the equivalent of having a cup of coffee every hour, right? Every spring, every big rainfall event is another cup of coffee. And the more you have, the longer it takes that caffeine high to wear off, right? In the same way here, if you have too much, I don't know about you, but I mean, coffee's not a problem. Too much coffee is not a problem. But my wife, you know, differing opinions on how much coffee. So now that's our problem, is that it takes a long time for that to run through the system and come back down to a good level, right?
What about the sand? That we talked about the soil getting into the lakes. But what if we're putting down sand?
So sand is part of soil.
Can you repeat the question so we can hear what that
Oh yes, very good. So she was asking, what about sand? So we're talking about soil running into the water, And she was asking about sand. What if you're putting down sand? Well, sand's a type of soil. Soil has three parts: sand, silt, and clay. Clay is the stuff that causes those big clods and chunks, and it's what sticks to the side of your car when you're going through mud, right? Silt is this really fine thing. That's the dust after a windstorm that covers everything. And then the sand is that coarse stuff that you'll see at beaches. And soil is always a mix of those three things. And so they all kind of behave in different ways, but they're all capable of carrying nutrients. So even if you have that sand, and sand actually has a lot of iron, sand around here has a lot of iron in it. And what iron does is it actually holds on to that phosphorus nutrient really, really well. And so actually when you have sand come through, it actually has a lot of nutrients on it. Even though it doesn't cloud the water the same, it does bring in a lot of nutrients.
Is organic compost or homemade compost, not using manure, like vegetable base, fruit base, is that a problem as well, or no?
Well, so what it's about isn't really the source of the nutrients, it's how much, and the most important thing.
Repeat the question.
Oh yeah, so the question was, are organic sources of fertilizer, of nutrients, still a problem versus using manure or chemical fertilizer? And the answer to that is that it really depends on, are you adding more to the system? So if the nutrients you're putting on your lawn are coming from a factory somewhere and coming into the watershed, now we're increasing the total amount, right? And that's a problem. Whereas if you use your grass clippings and things that have already grown in the ground, well, those things growing in the ground are taking nutrients out, then you compost it, you put those nutrients back. It's a closed loop, right? It's like if you used, gray water for a shower and then use that to flush the toilets, you're using it twice, versus if you just take a bottle of water from Walmart and put it down the drain, you just add more water versus using rainwater, right?
I'm not sure how to ask this question, but with keeping the shoreline with the native planting and everything, and then the sand would be not a good thing. But then you get these people that come in, and I have a good friend that's totally the shoreline thing, cattails and leaves it natural. It's unfortunate, and then his neighbor comes in, rips out all that, and puts in all this sand with a skidster, and no one does anything. So I think it's all wonderful ideas, but then he's sitting there, and he's been there for 40 years, and it's just sad for him. And then I don't know who monitors this, if it's the DNR or if it's Lake Camelot Association, but it happens over and over again, and they're ruining what really environmentalists would like to see happen. So do you have any ideas on that he wouldn't want to call in and get in trouble with the neighbor, and so he's very quiet about it. He wouldn't I wouldn't say his name, but who's going to monitor this? It's been going on for years.
Right. Well, this is entirely voluntary. I mean, you purchase the shoreline. That's your shoreline. I mean, the DNR has some guidelines on what you can do with it. But as much as some of us might value having, this beautiful natural barrier between the house and the lake, some folks want to be able to pull their boats right up. They want to see their kids play in the water. What we're really talking about is educating and explaining to people about the value of that natural habitat. What we want to do is explain why if you have differing ideas of what you want to see, whether it's a nice manicured lawn or some natural vegetation, the reason you're doing that is because you value something. You value it that way. And so what we want to do is we want to incentivize through education, explaining what that value is, and then there's also cost share efforts to help. And we can explain what you're losing, because a lot of times you don't, I don't know about you guys, but I don't do a lawn test every day to see how much nutrients I'm losing from my lawn. I'm not doing measurements to see how much of my shoreline's eroding. You might only see that after 8 years, and you have to bring in a couple of tons of sand to put that beach back. And then that's when your pain point is. And you're like, whoa, what could I do to stop this from happening? Or there's a big storm and you lose 10 foot of shoreline because it just washed away, right? So oftentimes we don't see that there's actually a harm there. And that's why this is so important. That's why this conversation is so important. And Dave's going to speak very specifically to that. He's going to speak to how we go from this to actual action at the shoreline.
Thank you.
Just a question, would it help if we get the fertilizer trucks down here in the spring? People would use less fertilizer on their yard, just pump it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Using less fertilizer on the lawns is a core practice. All right, then I'm going to jump into, for the sake of time here, the rest of the presentation there, just explaining something about the plan and how that's working, and then Dave can answer your questions about specific practices on the shore, and we will have a speaker from the ag community as well about what they're doing to help. So, what's a 9 key element plan? 9 key element plan is a plan developed in cooperation with the EPA and the DNR. It is a comprehensive management plan. It takes everything into account. It looks at what are the causes, what are the solutions, what is the specific, measurable, identifiable way we can make progress on this issue. It puts it all into a plan and says, all right, this is what needs to happen. And then it also accounts for having somebody such as myself come in to help make that happen. It's entirely voluntary. There's not a drop of regulatory rules in this plan from the county as far as this plan is concerned. It's not regulatory, it's voluntary. It's about education, engagement, and maybe greasing the wheels with some extra funding, okay? There's 51 active plans in Wisconsin. There's a lot of lakes now that have recognized the issues that they have. A lot of watershed associations have gotten together and said, let's do something about this, let's make a plan, and the state stepped up to help fund that, to make it happen. The 14-mile watershed is unique because this plan addresses both surface water and groundwater. And that's something unique here is like groundwater is very close to our surface water. What you drink in a well has 5 to 10 to 15 years from what's on the surface. In most other places, it's hundreds of years. Okay? And it also includes partnerships with multiple stakeholders. Usually these plans involve agriculture or lakes or a little bit of both. This involves everything from the WPVGA, the crop growers associations, to local organizations, to the canneries. It's a very involved plan. It takes everybody into account. So that's something very unique to this plan. So what's that going to look like as Adams County moves forward to implement this? Well, the first step is we want to understand the watershed conditions better. That means me getting to know all of you, understanding, as we said to that question, what matters to you? What are your values? Why do you want what you want? And how can I help meet you in the middle, right? It also involves understanding what's the condition of the lakes. 14 Miles has done excellent with that, with monitoring, and also in the agricultural community, I'm going out and engaging and saying, well, what does it actually look like? What are we dealing with, right? The next step is education and outreach. Things like this, right? Special events, we've got a couple of things coming up. And then connecting community members with conservation. This is the most important part. This is taking all this talk and discussion and then coming forward and saying, hey, we have a plan, let's turn that into specific action. And that's the most important part, right? So as towards understanding the 14-mile watershed conditions, we've had a ton of work done already. Surface water quality and soil samples have been done with the county and 14-mile watershed alliance. They've done an amazing job collecting that data. Shoreline surveys we've done for all the beach clubs now, and we'll go out to your individual property, give an assessment and give recommendations and identify specifically where you're losing opportunities and where you could make improvements. Some guidelines, and then Dave can help you make those a reality. And we're also initiating a well sampling campaign from Rome, Monroe, and Leola. And so there's 50 in each township that have gotten a free water test for their well, and we're putting all that together to get a better idea of what our well water looks like. Going forward, we'll be conducting surveys, both in the streams and on the cropland, to kind of get a better picture of what's going on throughout the whole watershed. We want to open up a soil health testing program. We've done this in the past where we'll come out and take samples of your lawn and help you develop an understanding of, what do you have in your soil, and that goes for both farmers and homeowners. And then also encouraging more research. I've been working with a lot of the research community from UW-Stevens Point, Extension, a lot of different government research foundations, and we're really pulling that together to get a very solid answer to the questions many people have. Education and outreach, expect to see a lot more meetings like this. Hopefully, Adams County can put out another progress meeting about what's going on with the 9 key element plan later this year. Otherwise, this is every year. I'm also hoping we can put together some small meetings, and there's a regular newsletter that comes out. 14-Mile Watershed Alliance helps us connect to folks with that. And then as towards connecting community members with conservation, The most important part here, we're working to help the producers develop producer-led watershed group. And that's where the producers get together and they organize just like the lakes associations, just like the watershed alliances. You know, they come together to help address this as a community. We also help connect folks as a county, especially what Anna James does, is help connect you folks with grants and innovation. If you've got an idea, usually there's funds to say, well, let's try that. Or if you're not quite sure if it's worth the cost to put in a big practice or modify your shoreline, we have grants and funding to help with that, and that's a big part of what Healthy Lakes is. Shoreline restoration, again, this is providing the technical expertise to help make it happen. And then field days, we're connecting folks throughout the community, bringing folks here on the lakes to the farm and bringing the farmers to the lakes and really helping make that connection, have a conversation, because that's all where it starts. So I was actually, after we had our initial informational meeting, a cranberry producer came up to me and said, hey, I'd love to host a farm day. I'd like to bring the community to my place and show them what we're doing for conservation. And so I helped them put that together. That's next week, 5:30 p.m. on the 9th, on Thursday there. That's at Leola Cranberry, just down the road. And then we also have, this is Scarlet Huntington Beach Club. This was a beach club project done. We had 30, 40 members of the community, everybody from retirees to the grandkids and locals and seasonal folk come out and help put together this project, this big shoreline project. And that was a big collaborative project that I went through. So I want to touch, I'm running a little low on time, so I just wanted to touch on specifically what role do the lakes play. So the lakes themselves are very complex. And we see the surface, but there's a lot going on under the water. And there's a very strong connection to the immediate shoreline next to the lake. They serve a certain biological function as an ecosystem. So what we have here is we see, this is 1937. This is Upper Camelot and Lower Camelot and then Arrowhead and Sherwood in there. So this is what it looked like before we put in the dams. This whole area that is now the lake, that one used to be a giant marsh. And marshes and wetlands function, shorelines function as lungs and sponges that filter out all those extra nutrients and all the other things that enter the water. This is what it looks like now. So we see all the shoreline, all of this flood basin that used to help filter water out during floods is now covered in concrete and yards and beaches. And so one very small thing we can do to restore this natural function to help reduce the nutrients that are already there and help reduce the impact of new nutrients is to restore a little bit of that function of the shoreline. And it doesn't take much. So here we see this was a county project on Camelot. You can see there's this shore and there's about a 1 foot drop. And the waves are coming in and just beating them down. And you can see how here on these trails here, all this water's rushing off and carrying everything with it into the water. So we came in and we installed shoreline protection so the waves couldn't break it down while the plants came in to stabilize it. And we have these erosion barriers. And this is what it looks like now. This was done in 2014. And this shore now is, and they've got a little entry for the dock there, but this shore now has been protected for 8 years. Right? And it's been, it hasn't eroded. All those nutrients that came from the shore are now being intercepted by that vegetation. Not only is this acting to filter water coming in, but as the waves come up and the water splashes and the water goes and interacts with those plants are eating up the nutrients that otherwise would go to algae. And so this itself is a small project, but you multiply this by the 5,000 plus lots on the lakeshore, that's a big impact. And it only takes a small area. All right, here's a slide on how you can get involved. I mean, you're here, that's already a huge step. 14 Mile talked about this a little bit as well. You know, you can get involved with the 14 Mile Watershed Alliance. It's probably one of the best ways that you folks on the lakes can get involved locally. To any producers, you know, getting involved in watershed protection group. You can also schedule a lakeshore visit or a field visit. We'll come out and do an assessment on your shoreline. There's a newsletter, as we said, and upcoming events. 14 Mile Watershed Alliance regularly has monthly events, or meetings, and they can speak more to that. And then we also have that upcoming field day. So I will leave that for. So I have a question slide here, but how are we doing on time, Karen? Do we got time for a few questions? Okay, all right, we got plenty of time for questions. So there are note cards. If I can't answer it here, I will get back to you. You know, give me your number, some contact information, my card's floating around.
Okay, I have the other mic, so if somebody wants to ask a question, let me know. I will jog over to you, run over to you, trip over to you, however I get.
It's not a real question. Can you just go back to the slide where it has the contact names of the people in your?
All right, he's asking.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we can go back to the slide with the contact names for the people who are helping. I just wanted to say, I've heard this presentation many times, and I'm always learning something new. And today, I really love the photo of what it looked like prior to the what it is now.
Well, and I went out yesterday.
That was really great.
On my way home yesterday, I went out and took that picture. And now I won't call out where that location is, but I have another picture. 3 feet down from that installation is the shoreline that didn't get improved, and it's got a bunch of boats docking up to it, and it's about a foot further inland than that planting is. So in those 8 years, they've lost all of that as shoreline. And I don't need to tell you how expensive shoreline is.
What lake and what beach club was that again?
I don't know which beach club it is, to be honest, but that was along one of the words. I haven't had my coffee yet. That's along Camelot. There's
It would be interesting to know so we can look at it.
Well, actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because we're going to put together the 14-mile watershed. Make sure you go to our website. It's 14mile.org. We do have good information there. But basically what we're going to do is put together with Kyle's help a map where everybody can see where all the Healthy Lakes projects, or any project, it doesn't have to be a Healthy Lakes project. So if you guys decided, oh, I want to have beautiful native wildflowers at my shoreline, do it. You don't need to get funds from the state, but that's kind of nice, right? To get the funds from the state. The other thing I want to encourage all of you to do, I don't want to, tramp on your parade, but the other thing I really want you guys to do, because I had never done it before, Colette over at Packers actually asked me to go with her to a field day one day, and I had no idea what that was going to be. I'm a city girl, literally from the city of Chicago. So for me to go on a field day was like total fish out of water. I went to the field day. I absolutely enjoyed myself more than I ever thought I would. It was a lot of fun. We got fed at the end. It was great. So I really encourage you to go to the field days. They're really, really wonderful. And you learn so much. And a lot of these farmers, we all know this, they're all trying to come to the same conclusion we are. We're trying to keep the water beautiful, keep the state beautiful. We're all in this together. So.
And I think that's really important. So somebody,
On that point of all of us together, all of us looking for one objective.
Yeah.
The lady over there that had the question, she said the neighbor doesn't want to tell on the other neighbor. How about if we all don't say anything and everybody just walks in and throws 1 cup of oil into the water and nobody says anything, right? It starts with you. We're all in this together, right? So if you see the neighbor doing something like that, you should say something, because if it's just him, what about the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy, and the next guy, and nobody says anything? What we have is water that's black.
so speaking to that is that
Thank you.
there's a certain line we have to tread, because this is people's properties, but we share the lakes. They're held in common trust. And so what we can do, and this isn't a new issue. I have records at the county office going back to 1979 talking about lake management plan, trying to help control pollution and helping to control sediment and the structure of the dams and lakeshore erosion. I have maps from the DNR saying these soils are at very high risk of nutrient pollution going back to 1989. There have been many different efforts, all smaller, localized efforts where people have been working to improve, and there has been massive improvement. But it's hard to see because we hit a certain threshold in the lake and we get algal blooms. But it's like if you have a car in your garage. Let's say you've got an old 1969 Shelby GT. And
Very specific. Very specific.
yeah. Well, that was my dream car, and then I sat in one once. I tried to sit in one once. That was the end of that. Top Gun, right? I thought I was going to be a fighter pilot. 12 years old, I was over 6 foot. I was told, not a chance. Anyway, my dreams. But so let's say you have that in there. Now you need a new transmission, wheels are shot, You need to rejet the carb. You don't even have seats in it. Now let's say 10 years later, you've got some seats in there, you redid the transmission, you still don't have tires on there, the carb's still gunked up, but it's now, you've done half the work to get it running. And your wife goes, why do you still got that thing taking my parking spot? And you're like, I'm working on it. I don't see any progress, but the man knows. And that's the thing, is unless you have the specialized knowledge to look at that and see what progress you have. Now, if your expectation is that that Shelby is going to take you from here to New York tomorrow, well, that's not a realistic expectation. We can't approach it like that. That's just not going to happen. But if our expectation is that by the time you die, your kid's got a really nice Shelby that'll take them for a quick trip, we can work with that. And maybe we can get a little extra help from the wife to hand a tool or two to get it there and get it out of the garage. And so that's where we have to see incremental progress, and we have to be okay with it not happening overnight, but recognizing the little improvements that we have. Maybe it is 2 or 3 less algal blooms in a year, or 1 less algal bloom. Then the next year it's a little bit more, and the next year it's a little bit more. And that's what it's going to take, because this is a problem that's been building for a century. It's been building since the 60s, since the 50s, since the 40s. And so we can't just approach it as tell them how to do it right. Because this is people's properties, this is people's lives, this is something that somebody saved a long time for, to get this dream house on a lake. And a lot of you have retired up here because it's beautiful and you love it and this is yours. And so what we have to do is help people understand how to protect that. And telling them what to do has never gone anywhere. It's just speaking, I'm from the government, all right? I'm here to help, all right? How's that ever gone? So what we can do instead, though, is recognize that let's put our money where our mouths are. Let's get our shoreline. And here's the thing, too, is a lot of folks are coming into the lakes, and they're not always here. So they don't always see changes over time, unless they show up another spring, and they're here for a couple of weeks, and they say, oh, look, my neighbor's got this thing on their shoreline. Okay, what a weirdo. He just brought down I got a golden crisp, not golden crisp, sorry, I'm from the sand country, we don't have irrigation. Nice green lawn up to the water. Your boat's up there, kids are playing in the water, that's great. They see the neighbors, and there's a bunch of weeds and trees. There goes the neighborhood. And all of a sudden they come back another year, that person's a pariah. They come back another year, 5 other neighbors have it, and they go, oh, I gotta get on that. The first and second person to do something new, buy a Tesla, get an electric car, solar panels, they're nuts. The 5th person to do it, visionary. Okay? And that's what it takes. It takes a shift in culture. It takes a shift in what we see as valuable. And to be honest, those yards, nice green rolling grass from your house to the water, clean vista, that's what you're sold. Years and years and years since the suburbs were developed, that's what we're sold as what you want. That is, my wife and I just bought a house. We now have a lawn in the city. We didn't do the country before. And my wife and I were like, dandelions, whatever. And now my wife is sitting there, and every other neighbor, she's like, hey, can we get a weed eater? And she's out there mowing before, 9 o'clock. And I'm like, I thought we were cool with just having, a messy yard. And she's like, yeah, but we're the only house that doesn't. And I'm like, okay, well, we're doing this until we put everything into native garden beds and stuff, and we got all this. But it's hard, right? Because unless you have that momentum started, it's hard to see that value, and it's hard to see the value of that change. Right?
But it's also education.
Absolutely. Yep. That's the thing, is teaching people, letting them know what they're missing, right?
We've been on Lake Shore for 25 years now.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see, there used to be something called Shoreline Preservation Act,
Yeah.
and that was kind of null and void. And that's where not the problem started, but people started smashing houses, put brand new, put 100 feet of lake frontage sand in front of their place, and just grass to it. And you see more and more of it. The lake is getting greener and greener.
Yeah, and that builds up over time and has a threshold. Something to remember, though, if you built your house... Yeah. So if you put your house in here 20, 30 years ago, and now you see a change, you're like, think about the person who had the house in 1930. Their grandparents bought it, and it was a nice marsh, and they got eminent domained out, and now there's this shoreline house there, and they used to hunt turkey. Not in the 30s, the turkeys were dead. But they used to fish there, and now there's a nice house with some good equity there, and they might feel the same way. And so we have to be cognizant of that, right? We have to recognize that, yeah, this is what values to you, but if you don't recognize what's valuable to somebody else, you don't have common ground. And then you can't bring them on, on board. So it's tough because we see this and it hurts because we see what it could be and we see what we dream. And we're running out of time. And it hurts and it's frustrating, it's hard, but that's the part of where you have to be, that patience is the hardest part.
Another question?
This may be a question for the lake associations, but for those who don't live directly on the shoreline, but are more in like the riparian area and have a dog. So I'm over on Lake Arrowhead near South Beach. Can we plant native plants, by the dock? Because we've had a home 12 years there, and I've seen from the dock, it's probably because of erosion, we've had to, it's probably gone down about 1.5 feet, and we've had to kind of move the dock progressively out because of that, and and it's just all rocks and that kind of drop-off cliff that you're talking about at our dock. So I don't know if that's a practice that you would recommend, or if we would talk to the association or what.
Right, so it's not required, but you're all shareholders of those properties, of those associations. You have legal rights to those beach clubs, and all the beach clubs now have, I believe all of them have had assessments done, and recommendations are coming out now from our offices saying, hey, here's what we recommend, and it's available to the lakes associations and the beach clubs to say, hey, here's what we recommend to achieve these specific goals. Then the lakes association has to go, okay, is this something our people want to do? Well, so that's where it's up to you to go forward and say, hey, listen, I have a stake in this. This is what I value. This is what I'd like to see. And enough voices go, and enough people say that, and that's the new norm. Karen likes to say this is building norms. Is we want that conversation instead of being, the new idealized norm of your perfect lawn, maybe being that perfect lawn with a nice wildflower buffer, and you see the pollinators in there, and you see, the fish habitat, and you don't see an oil slick outside your house. Maybe that's the new norm we want to strive for, but it takes people saying and doing it so other people can see it, right?
And also, we're protecting ourselves. At the end of the day, that's what we're doing. And I always kind of liken everything to being a parent, because that's the thing I'm the most proud of that I did. And basically, I didn't use a lot of punishment to get my kids to do things. I would reward them. So if we have neighbors who aren't doing what we think they should do, maybe we should encourage them, maybe inspire them, and at the end, reward them. Because that's what really, really works with people. I can tell you right now, my husband, who's standing back there, my wonderful husband, he was not a fan of native plantings, not at all. It took me years to get him to buy in. And now, he's like the biggest promoter. He loves it. And it's beautiful, and we're just starting. So I really encourage you to go around your lakes, look for those plantings on the shoreline. They're not that hard to do, and by the way, they're very little maintenance. So if you're a person who doesn't like to spend all your weekends working on the grass, then get a shoreline planting of native wildflowers, because basically you just watch them. That's it. That's all you do. So it's a lot easier in the long run. Any other questions? Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one question. Maybe it's a two-part question. I'm a software engineer, but I'm not a chemist. But is there ways to mitigate the nitrogen by adding something to, let's say, science steps in and put some other chemicals? I don't want to add more to the problem, but there's got to be a way to mitigate some of that algae bloom without impacting the fish hatcheries and things like that. The second part of it is I did a little experiment where I left one side native and the other side non-native. And what I found out quickly was that with the amount of boat traffic that these lakes obviously clearly were not, excuse me, designed for, I'm all for having fun. I used to do a lot until I injured myself. So that being said, I did an experiment. One side native, the other side nice rock, all the sand, all the cool stuff. And what I quickly found out is that my other side that I left that way, native, got just as washed out and is starting to peel itself off as well. So I saw your design, I like that a lot. But I think there's a twofold problem going on here is that, yeah, cool grass is everything. But when you start seeing the boat traffic and you're trying to mitigate that and you get waves that come up 5 feet onto your property, you're fighting to lose a battle by that shoreline. Wash off is one thing, but we're certainly butting heads up against two different things. So back to my chemical question, I'll let you go.
Yeah, so That's a very common solution that's promoted. It's very appealing because you might see some short-term benefit. And it can be, in some cases, a part of the solution. If we're talking about dollar and dollar, though, you put that treatment in, and at that point in time, what we have here with this drawing, hopefully you can all see it, is we have nutrients that come in, dissolved in the water through runoff, and also through groundwater. Then it cycles in the lake. There's an ecosystem, and it varies on time of year. And a lot of that actually gets trapped in the sediment. So we have an extremely rich layer of sediment on the bottom of the lakes that are just chock full of nutrients. But that's trapped in those nutrients. Part of the issue might be boat traffic turning it up, but it still needs to be interacted with biologically. The nutrients still have to get to the algae that are floating in the water. So the chemical treatments like alum or something else like that, what that does is you put it in the water, and if those nutrients are in the water at the time you apply them, it will bind to those nutrients and sink them to the bottom. But it's a lot like, so something I was thinking of the other day. Let's say you turn on the tap on your your tub, and you put the plug in, and alum is like a bucket that you put in under that tub, or that faucet. The tub isn't filling up, you're not getting more nutrients in, but once your bucket's full, you have to take that away, put in a new one. And that's what those alum treatments are. They're constantly buckets trying to pull out. Problem is, if your bathtub is already full, when you put that bucket in and pull it out, it doesn't make a difference anymore. Right? If your tub's already full and you put it under the faucet, it fills up, you're not going to change, the tub's already full. It's already maxed out. And that's where we're at. So you could do that for some very short term, but the thing is that there's just more coming into the system off of the entire watershed. And so it's like trying to fix it at the end. It's extremely expensive. So it might be if there's targeted areas like bat bays or some spaces where that treatment could be helpful, it could be a part of the solution. But overall, it's not stopping the flow. It's not stopping the fundamental problem. It's an ounce of prevention, right, is worth a pound of cure. Not only that, but these natural shoreline restoration, restoring floodplains to intercept and take the nutrients before it even gets to the lakes. Those are all active year-round. They're active all the time. They need minimal maintenance. So that's something that we're, at least from the county and from the plan, focused much more on. The decision to do chemical treatments or something mechanical to manage the problem now while the other things are going on is a decision that folks whose money's on the line have to decide.
There's another question.
So as we've all come to enjoy at Lake Camelot, the development of the lodge and all the activities and all, and many more boats on the lake, we've been here 30 years, which is wonderful. That's why we come here. However, I have seen the shoreline in front of the lodge as boats come into shore, want to land on the sand, make it easier to get into the property. The shoreline has really eroded back. And so the grass is back, the sand is back. So what is that doing to that swimming area, and what can be done to prevent that shoreline keep moving back? It's moved back quite a bit in the last 5 years, I would say.
I think I punt that question over to Dave during his presentation, but there's a lot you can do to stabilize the shore. But I mean, as we talked about the boats, it's very convenient to come up to the shore, but the boats are very destructive. It's the same thing. I mean, you wouldn't drive your car on your lawn every day, but we're driving boats up on the lawn every day, right? So maybe that's something that we have to consider. If we value that shoreline enough, maybe we put some extra money in to put in some structures, a dock, or we find some other way to approach that shore. And that's going to be an owner's thing. That's going to be the lodge's decision on where they want to go with that. The recommendations have been made for them, and there's certain practices you can do, but it will require change, and it will require an expenditure of capital to make those changes.
But there are grants that an association could get besides individuals, correct?
Absolutely, yes, and actually 14-Mile Watershed Alliance.
Yeah, we've actually done some on Lake Sherwood. Dave can talk to that. We've done some of the Healthy Grants programs on the beach clubs. It really makes a difference. I mean, literally, if we can get every beach club and every community area to do it. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Lake Sherwood. Have a lot of you been to the lodge there? Okay, the lodge has a beautiful, it's outstanding, Healthy Lakes project right there that everybody sees if you're going around Lake Sherwood. You see it all the time. That's what a Healthy Lakes shoreline, they call it a buffer, I hate that term, but a native planting looks like a wild, I like even saying wildflower planting. I mean, a lot of this is just terminology, but it's really flowers and it's beautiful things. And again, we're talking no maintenance. That's like one of the key parts of this. So not only does it look good, but it does a lot of good. Those roots can get up to, I think it's like 6 feet, your size. They can get that deep. So everything that runs off of Lake Sherwood, everything that from the road, from everything, is going to go through those beautiful long roots and filter, literally filter the water. So my husband and I, we've been doing these shoreline plantings. We've actually got every one of our downspouts going through where there's native plantings. So nothing that comes off of our house is going to, or even our area, most of it is covered with shoreline plantings. It's all at some point, this is our first year. It's going to be long enough, those roots will be long enough, and they will filter. And we still have a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions, comments, concerns.
What's the largest source of, what is the largest source of the nutrients that are coming in? Like what is is there any big, like, sources?
So,
is it lawns, is it industry, is it?
Right, so it's really, and this is where it gets challenging, it's a mix of all of them. And so what we have is that, for instance, every year, every couple of years, farmers will go out into the field, they'll apply fertilizer, and then they'll till the soil, and some of that soil might escape, and good water and nutrients will go in. But then also remembering that when these lakes were built and all these houses were built, I mean, 6, 7, 8 foot of soil was moved, mounded, pushed to the side, bulldozed, exposed for years on end. That floated into the lake, and now it's stuck in the lake. And so if we look at the whole system, if we look at the system as a whole over the past couple of decades, we see that the contributing sources to the nutrients in the lake are about 50-50 between internal loading, that's where we have all this legacy nutrients from past development in dams, and new nutrients entering in from the lakes, and about 50% from agricultural land use. And when it comes to that, a little bit on that, for you folks as you're concerned about algal blooms, the tri-lakes are limited on phosphorus. They need both phosphorus and nitrogen. Nitrogen is like the candle with the wick and the wax. It'll burn and endure. It's the base nutrient that everything else needs. But what they're short on in these lakes is phosphorus. Now, all of that phosphorus comes from around the lakes. It's very hard for that phosphorus to come from farmland. It's a lot easier for nitrogen to come from farmland than lakes. But when we look at the system as a whole, it's about a 50-50 split. A little bit more phosphorus around the lakes, a little bit more nitrogen from the farmland. And that's a little, if you go out and look now and you see all this farming versus, all the grass and yards, it's a little hard to see in your head how that works. But to get that house there, used to be for thousands of years of forest that kept building nutrients. And when that was bulldozed and a house was put in there, all of that was lost and added to the lake.
Is this, okay. So we've been here for about 10 years. The last 3 years, I've been really frustrated with the algae blooms. Start of August, right? We like to boat and we like to ski and things like that. So it's frustrating because we don't feel safe, like we can put our kids in the water. So I've been doing my own research. No expert by any means, but learning a lot about dredging, lily pads, obviously some chemicals. You kind of spoke upon that a little bit ago. Those are all very potentially at this point cost prohibitive. But is it something that we should be considering any of those steps where there should be some fundraising, some sponsors, some donors, things, a committee putting together to come and put money towards things like that, because maybe those will be made a little bit bigger impact potentially. I don't know, you can speak upon that, but I'm just wondering if there's potential for those things to make a bigger impact sooner that us impatient people could, you know, take pride in.
As towards the impact, it's really, every one of those would need to be studied in depth, because it's so complicated. You're changing something. It's the lakes are no different than a human body, right? And I just had wrist surgery because I had like carpal tunnel in my wrist, and the question was like, well, okay, what would work now? So I got a cortisone shot. 2 years later, I still had to go in for surgery and get that done. Cortisone shot helped a little bit. Now, but I had to talk a lot with my doctor and really figure out, is that the right way, or is it PT? So I tried some of the cheaper options, and before I went to the more drastic one. In this case, the more drastic options, they are cost prohibitive, and that's what was wrong with my wrist. But what we're talking about in this case, the ultimate solution for me was to have surgery on this. That's the opposite for the lakes, where the small little things we can do over time, because it's a natural system, are preferable. But we also have to have expectations for what we can achieve. With my wrist, I'm never going to go back to what it was beforehand, but all those little parts played a role. So I had to work very closely with my doctor to figure out what they are. Now, in this case, the organization that you're speaking of directly is actually the Tri-Lakes Management District. They're the ones who are developing lakes plans for the management for lakes plans. They're the ones who are working actively on these projects and on the big picture of how do we manage these lakes sustainably. How do we fix it? How do we make progress now? How do we make progress in the long term? They've been supporting the 9 plan. They're also exploring alternative options to bring some relief now. But it's very much like the human body. When you're sick, you can take an Advil, you can take a Tylenol, you can go to PT, but eventually you have to maybe make some lifestyle changes. And that's what we're looking at right now. A few less brownies, a little less caffeine, but until I get there, maybe I can jump on a treadmill. Maybe I should, do this, that. Maybe I should take blood pressure medicine, right? That's what we're talking about. So the sort of things you're talking about are like that, but we really have to keep in mind that when you feel better, you're week 1 into PT like I am, and your wrist feels pretty good. You've got to move next week, and you're like, I can lift that. And now I'm sitting here, I'll go home and put on a brace because I may have overdone it. I was too confident in the change. So that's just something we have to keep in mind. But yeah, Tri-Lakes Management District is working very hard to try to bring some sort of relief in the shorter term and keeping an eye on the long term.
And let me say, we want you in our group. We want you in our group, and if you're not in our group, we'll force you to be in our group. Because it's really important. Nothing changes unless we make a decision, an intentional, conscious decision. We either do something or we do nothing. And there's a consequence to each one of those decisions. And again, I get up every morning, except this morning, and I work out. It's not like the thing that any of us really look forward to, but I actually told myself one day that I was giving myself a gift. And that's what motivated me to get up every morning to work out, because I was giving myself a gift. We should look at this watershed project the same way. Our lakes is the same way. If we're putting down the native plantings or doing anything, there's a lot of things we can do. But if we're doing anything, then we're doing something, okay? And that's what we need to do. Thank you very much, Kyle. You were amazing.